Yeah, you're right, Nick. What are we talking about? Roughing the passer. All right. It's time to ruffle some feathers with episode 14. That's what we're gonna do, all right? We're gonna get in here, we're gonna have a fun time. Y'all, welcome back. Men to Mind episode 14. Hey, we deep right now, okay? I thought 10 would be like our cut point. Like, hey, we did this. It was a thing. No, we're 14 episodes in, y'all. If y'all are still rocking with us, thank y'all for being here. If y'all are new, welcome. As always, like, subscribe, share. If there's something you find interesting, please share with your peeps. We're here to just help the masses and just get some good content out there for people who want to mend the mind. So, episode 14, Nick, let's give the people a taste of where we're headed and what we're gonna dive into tonight.
Yeah, we're excited. We're still trying things out. New ideas come to us during the week. Maybe we'll give it a go since we're 14 in. And today we're going to try something we haven't done before, which is take an article and walk through it a little bit and talk about maybe some of the things that they found and whether we agree with it, disagree, some of the conversation around it. Certainly, the goal is not to say anything's right or wrong, but just to get good conversation going. What we'll be talking about today is the article name is Professionalism and Ego Management, Proposed Strategies for Understanding Professionalism and Dealing with Its Current Accelerating Decline. And it's an article that somebody just sent to me at work, thought was interesting, thought we could get some good conversation out of it.
Yeah, facts. And that if we can make sure to drop this in our links or in the description, so people can open it up if they want to read along and kind of just see where we're at and see what we're looking at. I think that'd be super huge for them, and if they want to read it on their own time. So we'll make sure we get that in there for them as we dive into this.
Yeah, completely agree with that, and 100% support as always. If you want to drop a like, comment, help us out there. Appreciate that. And if you have comments about the article, thoughts or ideas that came to you, would love to read those and see what you guys are thinking. Yeah. Always going to get more brains in the conversation and dive a little bit deeper. But the whole article today, kind of interesting. It's set up around this idea of a professionalism crisis. Is the first section, and so I think we'll just kind of jump in and start there. More or less, they've got some evidence that says how they would define professionalism, which we'll get into, is on the decline, and workers, especially young workers, are continuing to have lower and lower levels of this professionalism, which is compromising the workforce, which is not great because they say that not only is professionalism highly valued, it predicts success, and a lack of professionalism is strongly associated with failure. Now is probably a good time to kind of define professionalism, how they use it. Some of the attributes that they're saying fall under professional persons be honesty, integrity, good communicative ability, high moral and ethical standards, competence, responsibility, accountability, self-awareness, and altruism. Any thoughts on that initial definition on professionalism, Mr. Mike?
So I'm gonna actually jump back to just the title of it. When you first sent it to us, my initial thought was actually super fired up because my experience and my perception of professionalism is rooted in exclusivity, and it is a very, if this I think is exclusionary. Is that a word?
I don't know if it's a word, but we can run with it.
I'm trying to make it a word. It's not. But professionalism is very exclusive in itself because, and again, these are my initial thoughts, because who has access to what is considered professional, right? So that was my thought. Like I thought about the things that I may have done growing up, or some of the places that I was, people I was around, whether it was a banquet, a super cool, like sporting event type thing, a nice dinner, and it was formal attire, professional attire, all of these things. And I would be looking around like, okay, so this is what this is, but who has access to this? And the people that had access to professionalism were professional the definition of it in my head at the time, I thought, okay, this is something that is very, very exclusive, and this does not sit well with me. Like, this is not something that I resonate with or I feel like I'm in tune with. But as I take a look at the definition that we have here, I wish the article would stop closing. As I take a look at some of the characteristics of what is considered professional, like you just read, honesty, integrity, good communicative ability, high moral and ethical standards, competence, responsibility, accountability, self-awareness, altruism. I think those are phenomenal characteristics of what it means to be professional. I also think those are phenomenal characteristics of what it means to be a good person.
Right.
not just professional, like, okay, hey, you got these things. Like, you're a professional. Sure. If you want to throw me in that category of, hey, you have all these things, you're a professional. All right. I guess so. But I think it is much, much deeper than that. And so that was my initial reaction. So when I told you, like, oh, I'm fired up about this, I got fired up. Like, I think this would be one of those reads where I would need 2 or 3 to fully digest it and figure out what's going on, or just fully understand it. But those are my initial reactions to what's happening.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I had similar thoughts, especially considering, well, who's writing and defining professionalism?
Exactly.
I think one common theme, and gonna dive in with it, I think, throughout, is just this idea of, is it that the workforce is unprofessional, or is it that the workforce is not the same as it was a while ago? And, it's not necessarily a bad thing if it's changing or developing. I think we're all allowed to have opinions one way or another on that.
Yeah.
But I do think it's changing. And I think
Absolutely.
that's the most interesting piece to me. Because like you said, one of the things that they get into here is right next to the attributes of a professional person, they have the attributes of self-actualized people. Turns out there's a lot of overlap. They'll actually start to use this somewhat synonymously throughout the article. And that's fine and that's good. I think the more self-actualized people are, in a lot of ways, there are benefits with that. But I don't know. We'll dive in more. I've got thoughts about like what the causes are. I think it's going to be big to start with what they say on the article first. They pose that the decline in their definition of professionalism is an indication of larger societal and cultural issues at play. On board with that, and they're going to pair it with this idea that there's an increase in narcissistic behavior. Also on board with that, with how they're going to define like narcissistic behavior, just as this thing coming as a misguided self-esteem movement whereby people were advised to offer frequent praise to children, which may have been overdone and may have some impacts later. I think that's important, and that's something that I'll come back to. But the increased pressure on children to achieve perhaps led to an increase in narcissistic behavior, which they're going to posit as may also be part of the reason that there's a professionalism like decline, if you will. The next thing that they do is kind of define professionalism through Maslow's needs. And so Maslow had the hierarchy, his pyramid, if you will, or the hierarchy of needs. And more or less, it's this idea that you got to start with the bottom of the pyramid and build the pyramid up. So you get your physiological needs, your breathing, food, water, sex, sleep, homeostasis, just the different things that are going on with your body. Above that, safety becomes the next level that you need. So security of body, of employment, of resources, of morality, family, of health, property. So just a lot of physical things kind of around you and this feeling of being safe. And then once you have that, the next step would be friendship, family, intimacy. So again, another level, kind of having a support system now, not only physically, but your circles of support. And then they go into esteem. So self-esteem, confidence, achievement, respect of others, respect by others, something that I think as we go up, this becomes increasingly more relevant to the workplace. And then finally, self-actualization, which they highlight things like morality, creativity, spontaneity. I don't even know if I'm saying that right, but problem solving, lack of
Spontaneity.
prejudice.
Spontaneity.
Okay, there it
That
is.
one, when I first learned that word, that one got me too. It's all good.
I was like, I think this is spontaneous, but this ending is going to throw me for a loop. But some problem solving, lack of prejudice, acceptance of facts. Still very relevant to the workplace. And I'm on board with this. I think that the pyramid, has mostly stood a test of time in the sense that it gives people a pretty good idea of kind of what the levels are, and then the idea that you got to go sequentially up, right? So start at level 1, level 2, 3, 4. Any thoughts from you with the hierarchy of needs? Have you seen this before?
So I've heard of the hierarchy of needs, and I know I've heard of it. I've seen it maybe once or twice, but I didn't really remember it until I reread it and really took a look at how it was broken down. Familiar with it, but I probably couldn't have spoke to it very very intelligently about what it looked like. But as I look at this, the hierarchy right below that has the flip between true professionalism domain and non-professionalism domain, those two things rocked me, because I think it's strange that self-esteem, confidence, achievement, respect of others, respect by others somehow fall in the non-professionalism domain range. Now I kind of understand how friendship, family, like sexual intimacy, I would have to agree with those. Like, you start blurring lines there, and then where you get to the second to last, if you're going down, security of body, of employment, resources, morality, family, health. It is also a bit strange to me how some of those things are not considered in the true professionalism domain. My thought is, when was the last time this was really looked at? It may be changed, because I think the definition of professionalism, or what it means to be professional, will continue to change. And I think we're seeing that right now, especially with our generation and then those coming behind us. When you look at the people being hired, the age gap, when you look at what people are wanting from work or want from a career, what they want work-life balance wise, all of those things have to now be factored in to what it means to be professional. Standing up for yourself, understanding that, this is my employer, but you're not going to run me into the ground just because you can. Like, I'm supposed to feel grateful that I have this job. I have an opportunity to make money for myself, or whatever the case may be, whatever it is that you're doing with the money that you make. I have this opportunity, and I'm supposed to just be head over heels grateful and bend over backwards every single time you ask me to do something. Like, I personally don't believe that's the case. So it is very interesting to take a look at this. And I wish it said on here when, let me see if I can find it real fast, when Maslow actually created this.
I want to say he's 60s, and then the one underneath it, if you're looking at like the true professional and non-professional, it looks like 2017 is when somebody.
Okay, there it is. Yeah. So even the one, there we go. Okay. Yeah. So it even says figure 2, Maslow's hierarchy of needs adapted. So there was some small adaptation to it. Not much, because it's pretty much a carbon copy of what Maslow did. But either way, so those were some of the initial thoughts that I had. Is, when was the last time this was really examined and somebody did a deeper dive of what it means to be professional and some of the characteristics and attributes that go into it now?
Yeah. So I think that's an interesting point. I might actually be able to answer some of that for you on the spot, which would be cool. So Maslow's hierarchy, to my knowledge, and I could be wrong about this, but is pretty widely accepted still, just in the sense that it holds. A lot of the theories today will still reference it and be all right with it, but specifically, it's a lot of positive psychology has built itself on the upper half of the pyramid. And so specifically esteem and self-actualization. That's where a lot of positive psych is. That's a lot of like the topics that we'll have on the podcast.
Right.
Kind of come from there. And it's an understanding that the bottom ones need to be filled, but maybe it's not directly talked about a ton.
Okay. All right.
The second graphic underneath it. So you'll see that you've got your non-professionalism and your true professionalism, which I agree. This feels like something that's really easy to say from the top of a professional pyramid, to say that, self-esteem, confidence, achievement, respect of others, and respect by others is non-professional if you've already fulfilled all that. But I think for people who are maybe lower on the totem pole at work, like those definitely feel part of the professional domain. So I think there's an argument for either side, but I would agree with you. It would be very interesting to see, why the line is where it is on that, just a little bit deeper. I do think that it's super interesting that they've got it paired exactly with the true self and the ego over on the left. And so true self and true professional, and then ego and non-professional domain, or professionalism domain. Pretty interesting that that's an exact map. And part of the reason that I am understanding that that's there is that idea of ego theory on the page before. I think it's page 5. And so Maslow's hierarchy kind of says that psychological disorder can be defined as anything that causes someone to deviate from moving towards the top of the pyramid. And so if you missed a step, or somebody wasn't able to fulfill or was actively hindering something on this pyramid, then that would create, your psychological disorder, in quotations there. And so the role of psychology is really to get people back on track there, and especially like therapy. That's how he viewed that. Clayton says that was actually first put forth in 43, which is crazy. It stood that long. So you go through that sequential order, and then we jump in with ego theory. They propose this false self versus the true self. And you'll see again, true self is the top of the pyramid, whereas the false self is, when we believe this false story about ourselves, and live our lives from that perspective. And so you go into a room and, maybe you're just not being fully authentic to yourself. The more often that you do that, the more often, this false self might be present.
Yeah.
And so for them, they're mapping that idea onto something that would antagonize a true professionalism. Kind of on board with that, but that's where it gets tricky for me when we talk about, where is the split? Why is the split where it is? Well, why are people acting like their false selves at work? Is that the worker's fault, or is that the management and the environment's fault?
Yeah, very good question. Very good question.
I'd say probably a little bit of both, right?
I would have to say it is a little bit of both, but if I had to choose one over the other, I'm gonna say it's the job or the company's fault, because this is the standard that you have set, that people, if you don't fit into this mold of being, and I heard this one time, a culture fit versus a culture add. You can hire somebody who fits your culture, who is exactly what you're looking for. This shape goes in this hole. It's like teaching little kids, triangle goes here, square goes here, circle goes here. Yeah. We are looking for circles, and we hire all circles. Sometimes that square and that triangle, though, are culture adds, and they change the dynamic in the way they think, the way they their creativity, and it also will help out some of those circles along the way. So I oftentimes think it is the employer or company's fault for creating an environment where people think they need to show up this way in order to be accepted. If it isn't from day one, like, oh wow, you present yourself to be X, I like you this way, come as you are.
Yeah.
When that flow is disrupted and companies or even people feel like they can't show up as themselves, I think that's where you start showing up as somebody totally different. And I also think that's the piece where they think it's your ego. Like, okay, they're showing up as Nick is showing up as Nick. Nick is not showing up as Nicholas because that's not who he wants to be. He doesn't. I'm Nicholas Davis. No, I'm Nick Davis. I'm the same person. I can still produce the same work and have some of the same great qualities, but this is who I am. I'm not faking who I truly am to fit this mold in here. It's the same way if I were to show up in an environment. So I think that is a very, very significant factor in why people show up the way they do and why ego is perceived as ego versus ego being perceived as true self. Nobody said like I'm showing up as me that it's egotistical. People say companies love to say, hey, we want confident people. We want people who know that they're good, who know they produce good work. But when you start doing that and you show up as this egotistical person just because somebody else is in the same way, I think there's a disconnect there. And those who are considered egotistical, that's when they begin to change who they are to fit that company mold.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And I think you raise two really good points that I want to kind of reemphasize. One, why is this ego there, this false ego, if you will, or false self? Because there is a true ego or true self that would be good. But if that false self is there, what's the reason for it? Why are people acting less authentically and being this version of themselves that's not true? I think, to me, my head goes back to the pyramid itself, which they reference, but they don't necessarily make this connection. I naturally want to grow, and part of my growth needs to be, for it to happen, needs to be financially supported, right? What is the line, financially speaking, where you can have the bottom, like, half of this pyramid? Because if I'm in a job that doesn't give me the financial resources to feel physiologically safe, have this just sense of security, and then that love and belonging, I might act in my false self because I couldn't sequentially fill this. And so if you're an employer and you're not offering what your workers would consider to fulfill the bottom three of those, and that's a different debate that I don't really want to get into, but if their perception of it, if their reality is that they're not getting enough to live comfortably and fulfill those needs, the false self is going to come out. And again, makes it a lot easier if you're in a position where your needs are, kind of filled in that bottom half to say, well, why aren't you being authentic? Why aren't you being true? Dude, I need this job so that I can try to fulfill these. I'm working at a disadvantage already. I just need to show up and look the part for this, and then hopefully it'll all fall in line.
Facts.
And that leads me to the second point that you brought up, which is this idea of acceptance from the company. You may or may not have fully self-actualized employees or professional employees, whichever term you prefer to run with when we're talking in the frame of this article. If you have some that are acting in the false self, and they offer solutions down here, but one, why are they doing it? And then two, what are you doing to help minimize that false self? Because they even argue in the paper, and I don't think they dove in quite enough here, but this artificial persona that people create comes about in life to protect that person's self from re-experiencing developmental trauma, shock, or stress in close relationships.
Read that again.
So the false self is an artificial persona that people create very early in life to protect themselves from re-experiencing developmental trauma, shock, and stress in close relationships.
Yeah.
To me, it sounds like a bad environment more or less creates a false persona. If you're willing to run with my interpretation there, then the only reason false personas would increase would either be, the only two reasons that first come to mind would be, we haven't dealt with this false persona that's come about from something, some mental, developmental trauma, shock or stress, or your company is further creating that for its employees.
No, I agree. Let me capture these notes real fast so I can kind of give my thoughts.
Hey, of course. I do think, and this might be a link for you, but where they go next with the article, hopefully it'll give you some time to catch up as well. It's interesting because they're going to go from this ego and this idea of this self-image, which I think largely lives in that esteem quadrant or level to Maslow's hierarchy. But they're going to start talking about how narcissism comes out from an increase in this false self being used. Again, if you're willing to run with the environment's a big cause for this. So the environment is creating narcissism in very simple terms, which they'll then pivot to the ego management is the way to go. And that's how you develop professionalism or self-actualized individuals. Well, was that enough time for you to kind of get some notes down?
Yep, it was. All right. So,
where's your head at over there?
Hang on, let me finish this thought. One more. This is going to be the, what is it called? It is the, Nick, help me out. You feel like you don't belong in a space, or you feel like
isolated or like alienated?
No. You feel like you were hired like as like a diversity hire, or like you're not qualified. What is
I'm now searching for the same word, but I know what you're talking about. Like imposter syndrome?
There it is. There it is. Yep.
I'm anxious to see where you're going with this now. Oh, man.
Okay, cool. So I tried to capture your two questions, which were, why is the ego or false self present? And then what does that look like from an acceptance standpoint via the company and or the team, correct? Those are the two questions. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you said that the false self is a protective mechanism to prevent future hurt. Like that, reading that out, that is 100% true. And you can find that in anything that you do. Like you decide to ride a skateboard and you fall off of it, you're going to remember that fall and you're going to be like, dang, your body is naturally going to want to protect itself from that happening again. It's the same way when you get in relationships. Like I understand that completely. And when we talk about why the false self is present and when we're looking for acceptance from a company or team, because we have people who haven't been exposed to these communities, to diverse backgrounds, to people who have been in different spaces other than them. I don't know what that noise is.
Oh man, they're cooking it up over there at Mike's. They got some pots and pans going. It sounds like.
Goodness.
And we roll with the punches.
Yeah, we just gotta roll with the smacks. So when people feel like they need to change to fit in because they aren't being accepted from a company or a team, like you said, I think it's a reflection of those who, if this makes sense, who are not self-actualized or who are the people who are egotistical. If we're gonna keep it in that same kind of flow of the chart here, because they have either assimilated to the current culture that is present, or they have their own and professionalism is subjective in itself, their own definition of what it means to be professional, and that if somebody comes in this arena, this is exactly who they need to be, which I think in turn then creates the imposter syndrome. Am I being hired here? Was I a diversity hire? Am I actually qualified for this position? Was I hired to fill a quota? And diversity is a very, very broad word and term in itself. A lot of times people think black and white when it comes to diversity, but it's so many other things: social status, diversity of thought. Like, diversity in itself is huge. So when we talk about imposter syndrome, am I actually qualified to be in this space with these people? And if I show up as my true self-actualized self, that sounds a little redundant, but if I show up as that person, how will that be perceived? And when it's met with maybe hostility or a little questioning of, oh, okay, who are you and why are you here like this? Why do you not look like the rest of us? I think that's where the disconnect starts to happen, and people start to people start to revert to the ego. And I take that back. It's not even reverting to ego. People are still being themselves, but there's a switch that is flipped in their head about who they are allowed to be and in what spaces. Like, they don't get to show up as their authentic selves all the time. So that's kind of where my notes kind of stopped and my gears started to slow down a little bit.
Yeah, no, I think that's huge. I want to dive in with this idea that you proposed as, that kind of self-preservation with the ego, similar to the falling off the skateboard example. But a lot of times it's this comparison, which we talked a lot about last episodes, and the self-preserving nature that they talk about in the paper, just briefly. You don't like to be rejected, and it doesn't feel good. And if you can avoid feeling rejected, you're likely to do that. And so if you've learned a certain thing that you do might lead to rejection, it makes sense to not act in that way, even if it is your true self. And I think that then ties in with values really, really, really interestingly for me. So again, I'm going to go to level 4. I'm going to call it, but the esteem on the pyramid, our hierarchy of needs. Self-confidence, or self-esteem, self-confidence, achievement, respect of others, respect by others. The most successful people are driven by this. Notice I'm going to say most successful. It's your classic type A personality that is super driven and perhaps leads to burnout, but they are very good at what they do. What I will pose, and what a lot of the research I enjoy finds, is that if you want the most successful worker, and we go back to that graph that we used a while ago, I want to say it was with Seth, where we had a, kind of your, like, I would trust you with my life and my wife versus the team cancer. And just this idea of like, how do you get the best workers? And it turns out that the highest performers, you walk in, you say, who's the asshole of the office? They'll point you in the right direction. The glue employees, or the ones that keep the office afloat, are probably more in that self-actualized tier, whereas those most successful and highest performers fall in that esteem tier. Not necessarily the happiest, but a lot of success there. And so if the idea is professionalism, and we're positing that earlier idea that professionalism and success are kind of synonymous, one, I have an issue with that. And two, I think you're going to have a lot of ego and self-esteem issues in that domain. And then, they dive in with, how do you develop towards self-actualization? Words, man. You develop towards self-actualization using Maslow's hierarchy. Well, if your goals are inherently extrinsic in content, how are you going to get out of the esteem tier? If your office is predicated on success and numbers and profits and not developing individuals, I don't know how you get out of it. I think that that's a losing battle. And I think that the culture there is really what needs to change more so than any individual worker's ego. Not 100% sure if we've got Mike here, if we lost him. So,
Can y'all not see me?
I can now.
Oh, I don't know what happened.
What are your thoughts on kind of that idea there?
So, I was jotting down something. Read me back the last part that you spoke on.
So I guess in sum, I think that, if we have this self-preservation against rejection and the environment that we're in is something that we see as maybe could lead to rejection, there's going to be issues. You mentioned, learning from mistakes kind of indirectly with the skateboard analogy. If I'm in an office where I'm afraid to fail and success is measured by numbers and metrics and just being able to produce,
Right.
I think you're going to struggle a lot to get out of the self-esteem area. I think, self-actualization is going to be very hard because how can you be your authentic self if you're afraid to try? I mean, in essence, that top tier is just rephrasing of creativity a few different times, right?
Yeah.
If your creativity is not being expressed because you're afraid to fail, afraid to reject, and the self-preserving factor comes in with your ego, I don't know how much more you can go up.
Right. So to further that thought, I think that there, and this really stuck out to me. This is what I was looking at here. So for anybody following along, if you all jump down to page, it's page 8 technically, but I think it's actually page like 5 on the document, but page 8.
Yeah.
And it said, the following are common strategies employed by individuals wishing to self-actualize. And I think the one that is, they all seem very important, but the one to me that's probably the most important is number 6.
Okay.
Self-development, knowing that self-actualization is a path and not a destination, working to do well the things one wants to do. So when you talk about that imposter syndrome, being afraid to fail, I think those are all a part of that self-development piece and the path that you are taking. Because self-actualization and self-development is not a destination. It is continuous, really, until you die. So I think that self-development piece is super big. And then number 3 really stuck out to me. Be aware of the uniqueness of yourself, knowing that one is not obligated to be like anyone else or fit in the confines of a particular mold. Knowing that we are who we are at our deepest core is both calming and liberating. So when you take those 2 things and you apply those to the workforce, you talk about showing up as yourself, not being afraid to fail. Those are things that you have to confront in those situations of, all right, am I going to lose as myself or am I going to win as somebody else? And then on the inverse, if I lose as somebody else, not being true to myself, I may as well have been true to myself in the first place. I'd rather take the L as me, and knowing that I gave it my all versus trying to be someone else. Right. So I think that is something that has to be considered when you ask the question of, when it comes to the workplace, showing up as yourself, not being afraid to fail, not being able to take risks, not being concerned about if people like you or not. Like, all of those things are super significant to have an understanding of and be willing to confront when it's time to confront it. So did that answer your question that you were getting at?
Yeah, no, I think that builds on it nicely, and I think it's a good segue into this, page 5/8. I like most of what they have on here.
Yeah,
I think that all of these can help with, that self-actualization, if you will, or increasing professionalism. But I don't know if it hits the mark on what they started the paper with, which was this crisis, if you will, of professionalism in the workplace.
Yep.
These behaviors will work. Where, when, and how can you practice these 8 different things? They offer some insight into self-analysis and mindfulness, and this ego management. And it loosely goes into awareness. There's a lot of gratitude practice here and mindful practices, I would say, throughout it, which are all really, really good. But how much does that help if you're going into the same work environment that failed you?
Yep.
Or if the society as a whole, as they pose, might be responsible for this? I don't know if bottom-up change is going to work in any timely manner for the workforce.
Yeah.
I think it's in my opinion, it's management's duty to provide environments where growth will come. I'm a big fan, as you and Nat know, of thinking about things as a whole system and thinking about how can you change the system rather than treat one specific symptom and kind of jump into the middle. To me, a lot of this paper kind of jumps into the middle some. And I think that the points are good. But I think that there's an underlying issue that is the environments don't really set us up for success. And if you were to invest in an environment that sets people up for success, the dividends will be there, but they're going to be there on the long-term train. It's not going to be something that you see an impact tomorrow. It's not going to be something you see the impact a year from now, but 10 years from now, when your company is sustainable, people want to work there, and you don't have any turnover, now you've hit the sweet spot. The problem is you got to invest in it, and you got to wait, you got to sit on it, you got to stay committed to it. And they touch a little bit on the benefits of ego awareness and ego management with managers here on page 6. And so they say managers too can benefit from becoming self-actualized by acting as mentors and examples for staff. In addition, learning how to manage their own ego and learning how to recognize this drama in others cultivates a more realistic and helpful approach when dealing with egotism in the workplace. That's a nice sentiment, but it doesn't address the fact that the managers are often the cause of this issue, or their managers are the cause of their issue, and we can kind of track it up the train. And so I think that they've got really good stuff in this article, and I think it's a great conversation starter, but I think they are asking the wrong question, which is what specifically leads to people to develop issues in this ego development, and how are we contributing to, or how are we fixing that issue as people who can make a difference? Because odds are your employees already have a pretty full plate.
Yeah.
It's not that hard to switch it when you boil it down. I would say the biggest things is how you talk to people, the language you use, and your ability to take perspectives and help people feel value, which I would argue you can do in about the same amount of time as what you're already doing, but the effect should be much better. And so I think that's where the education needs to be. I think you are muted, Mr. Mike, but I see you talking.
Dang, I'm glad you said that, because I was about to go on a good one.
I'm excited.
I had just scrolled down to that piece talking about managers. Like, I was about to read that. So I'm glad you hit on that, and I'm losing my thought here. So let me reread this for a second. Oh, okay. So I wanted to say that I too think the article, the premise or the thought of it, the initial thought is very strong. It grabs your attention real quick. And you're like, okay, what are they about to talk about in this article? Like, how are they getting there? So I think it did a really, really good job of roping us in, but it did not hold up in, again, addressing the issue, stating why professionalism in particular is seemingly declining, and what is causing it, more importantly. Like you said, like they talk about it for a quick second, and they use Maslow here, and in an adjusted or an adapted version of Maslow that's actually exactly the same. So I don't even know how it's really adapted, but the article presents a topic or question, and I think it also, the opposite side of that coin, they failed to properly answer it and give us some real rationale or reasoning why. I think they should have done a deeper dive into, all right, professionalism is declining, ego is rising. These are the reasons why. These are some of the major factors going into it. And if we want to see this professionalism and ego write itself. If we want to
Yeah.
say it can write itself. We need to address the root of it being either the company, the managers, the environment, whatever else is in there. Yeah, in both scenarios, I think that some professional people or those who are deemed egotistical can thrive in certain environments. I also think there's a gray area where both can thrive in the same environment, but it is up to those who set that standard. It's up to them to create the space for both of those two groups to be able to coexist in the same space and for them to find success there. If that's not addressed, I don't think we'll ever really resolve this issue, we'll call it, of people who feel as if, again, professionalism is declining and that ego is increasing.
No, I completely agree. And I think to give credit to the authors as well, I think they're on the same page. And I think ultimately this may just be laying a foundation for further work, but they had to
Yep.
this first, because they do mention a lot of the same ideas that we have ourselves. And, maybe we just read theirs, internalized, and then took credit. I don't know. But, they do mention that the decline in professionalism and increase in narcissism are likely correlated. And the root causes would be developmental issues. And this is a larger societal level. And then they go to talk about how a supportive work environment would be really beneficial. And so a lot of what we said as well. And we'll give them credit because they published this in 2019. But it's cool to see like everything kind of come together there. And I do want to dive in just a little bit more. Again, this was just an article that came across my desk at work, or through the email, I should say. But they might have done more on this. There's plenty of research out there that I think is relevant. I think the big question, and what I would love to get like some quick thoughts on, and we might even jump in with this more in the next episode. We'll see where we go. But this increased pressure on children to achieve via over frequent praise, and kind of these high expectations and stress, I think makes it really hard to get out of this esteem level. I think that ultimately is the same thing when they talk about, and these are all coming from the article, but I think that's the same idea that we're talking about, a creation of an artificial persona to protect us from re-experiencing developmental trauma, shock, stress in close relationships. And if that's the way that we learn how the world works as children, it's going to be very, very hard to break. That doesn't mean you can't, but it does mean you're setting a lot of people's defaults to something that is ego-driven and does rely on self-esteem, respect of others, and achievement. And if that becomes what people idolize, what people focus on, and I think social media does a really bad job with this and kind of promotes that, enables it, if you will, then it just emphasizes even more of the importance to have environments that are supportive. The most simple way that I can put it, and I believe we've talked about this as well, is if your manager comes into the room and you expect that they're going to ask for something and that relationship is going to be transactional, I would take a guess that the office environment is not super duper great all the time. I think that the best work environments that you see include a manager who can come in and just have a conversation with people. Now, there are downsides to that too, but I would argue those employees are going to feel more generally valued. And that's the biggest benefit that you can give to an office, is everybody feeling like they have value and that they fit in as themselves to this workplace. That's how I would say you get out of that fourth level and into starting that self-actualization.
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said. I personally think we can make a whole nother episode out of that, honestly. Because my thought was participation trophies. Like that would be another episode of, we are teaching kids that, and this might be a hot take, we're teaching kids that it's okay to lose, like that you get a consolation prize for simply showing up and giving less than your best. Again, hot take, I personally don't agree with that at all. And I think that is what a snippet in here kind of talks about. You're teaching kids at a young age to value just showing up, and for that to be a standard of, okay, I showed up, I am owed something because I'm here. So I think we can really, really get into that next week and find some articles and other tidbits of information to pad either side of the story, to give both, hey, this is what encouraging kids to show up does for their for their morality, for their self-confidence, for whatever it may be. And on the inverse, this is what happens long term when we get those same kids to, hey, just show up. Okay, you showed up and now you're owed something. I think it's very, very twofold there, and we can do something bigger with that.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And I think there's a flip side to it as well. There's issues with feeling like you're deserved something, and those are probably correlated with that narcissism piece pretty strongly. There's also issues in idolizing winning and success.
Yep.
Especially because it is just an outcome.
Right.
And in the same vein, avoiding and being so averse to losing. Being a sore loser is also something that is increasingly prevalent. And it's the same issues that I would argue are driving all of these. So how do we find a middle ground where kids learn from mistakes and don't, avoid them? How do we get to a state where failure, in essence, leads to growth, and that we can healthily reframe and accept people at their best and at their worst? Because that's ultimately the most healthy environment that I could imagine. You're not worried about getting fired because you made a mistake, but you tried something new, and that new idea may or may not be the one that takes everything up a couple of notches. Because you can't have that idea be born if people are afraid of trying something outside of the norm. But similarly, again, you don't want to reward anyone for everything that they do. That overdoing of praise is that participation trophy. And if you want to thank people for showing up, I don't have an issue with that, but make sure that they understand that it's for showing up.
Right.
Be very clear in what the award is for. And that openness and that transparency is often lacking as well.
No, I think that's a good point. I don't have any other additional thoughts on that wouldn't take us into a completely different topic. But no, I think that's very, very valid.
Yeah, I feel like we're both dancing on opening a can of worms.
Yeah,
so we will save that for another episode. But I do want to throw it out to you in reading this article, talking about it and reflecting on it a little bit. Is there anything that you are going to try to kind of switch up this week, focus on a little bit more, or maybe try to do a little bit less? Anything you're hoping to notice some? I know, like, for instance, towards the end, talking about those different things towards self-actualization, you said 3 and 6 stuck out to you. But anything at all that you're hoping to implement?
So I've actually been working on some of those things the past couple months, really. Being able to show up as myself, feeling as if I can be my authentic self in the space that I occupy, whether it's work, whether it's with being around friends, which is totally comfortable, but taking that comfortable self and showing up in a professional space where some of the slang I use maybe isn't received the same way, and it's only because people don't understand. I'm saying the same words; they're just synonyms. So I've done that for a very long time, and I'm actually super proud of myself for doing that, because I feel like the work I've been producing has been greater, um, has been at a higher level than what I was at before, because I feel like I was watering down who I am, who I really meant to be. So I don't have anything in particular I'm working on. I'm gonna just keep striving to show up as myself, to be authentic, to let people know that professionalism comes in many different shapes and forms. Be a culture ad versus a culture ad and a culture fit. Two things can be true at the same time. So having those two things for myself, and allowing people to realize, wow, he's different, but his different works. His different is present. His different is powerful. His different produces quality. So I'm gonna keep tackling that. I'm gonna keep tackling that and doing that for sure.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. I mean, and same for you. So what will be, if it's on that list of 6? Is there one in particular that you're gonna tackle, or are you going a totally different route? Was there something else in the article that you're like, I'm gonna work on that this week?
One thing you just said actually resonated pretty strongly with me, and then I had another one that just in general I think kind of ties in with that authentic or true self, and maybe being a little bit less of that false self. The one that you had just mentioned was this idea of two things coexisting, right? Like one doesn't necessarily have to be absent for the other to be present. And I think in the same way, it's very easy to compare things. So even something as simple as, Mike, you lived in Tallahassee and you've lived in Cincinnati, right? Which one did you like better? Like, which one was better for you? There's nothing wrong and usually nothing ill-intended about that question, but I don't think one has to be worse, right? Like this just idea that two things can both be good and exist. It doesn't have to be one or the other. Presents itself a lot in life. And so I'm hoping to maybe minimize the amount of that I do, or at least be more aware of it this week. It's just a random one that popped up. It's small, but I think it could have some impacts. And then I also think that just being a little bit more authentic with what comes to mind. I think that this last week, there's been a couple instances where I've taken a leap, if you will, and asked more of a, I don't want to say intrusive question, but maybe something with a little bit more substance. Whereas a lot of times, if somebody is upset about something, it's just, oh man, that's tough. I'm sorry that you're going through that.
Right.
But treating them as a person and saying like, oh, what about that is upsetting to you? There's no requirement to talk on it, but leaving the door open to have those conversations rather than avoiding it. That's something that I do a lot of, is just avoiding questions, especially if it's to save face, which I think ties in a lot with that false self, wanting to look a certain way in the environment. And so making an effort to truly embrace and start those conversations is something that I would love to do a little bit more of this week.
That's good. No, I think practicing both of those will serve you well. And I can't say I've ever noticed that in particular. I think when we have conversations, and whether it was in spaces where we were working together, or just hanging out, I've always felt like you were very, very good about asking follow-up questions to understand what the circumstances presented, and why I at least felt a certain way, or what I got out of something. So I think bringing it over and being the Nick that I know you are in those other areas, I think that'll really serve you well. So I think that's something powerful to tackle.
As always, would love to hear what any listeners are taking away today. Maybe something that you are looking to do this week. Odds are that when you guys come up with these, we actually think they're pretty good ideas and might try them ourselves as well. So we can all grow together, kind of do it as a brainstorm session. Love that. Always fun to read. And then I guess we'll be back next week. We may jump back in with this next week. We may push it on later, but it does sound like we've got more, at least in tangentially related topics. So thank you guys for joining us with that. Mike, anything you would like to add before we roll out?
The topic for next week is already set, okay? Participation trophies is on here, okay? Look. is on the pad, so we rolling with it.
There it is.
Nothing else to add. Awesome episode. I'm glad we're able to dive into the article a little bit. I think we can continue to tie a couple in and give and make this more interactive. Like maybe give some people some literature. I think it'll broaden the scope of people that we reach. A lot of this has been us just talking and bouncing ideas around and thoughts and maybe pulling from a couple theories, but to have some tangible material that people can tie it back to read, to dive into, maybe take into a classroom setting, ask people about. I think this adds another dynamic to what we're doing. So I'm glad that you popped this article in here and like Nick said, toss some ideas our way. Like we said in the beginning, like, subscribe, share, and episode 14. We'll catch y'all next week for 15.